The seventh applied precept. I bear witness to the elevation of the self and the denigration of others by myself and in the world, and aspire to meet others on equal ground. Traditionally, not praising self at the expense of others, or not praising yourself while abusing others. You're sat in Zazen, in Zendo. Your mind flicks around the others present. How come everyone seems so much better at this than you? Their posture more stable, their concentration implacable. Or, how come nobody else here really gets it? Their sloppy posture, constant fidgeting, and even their strained efforts at concentration, ridiculous. And then you remember Barry's dictum, you can't do it wrong. You see, you've been judging yourself against the others. Been doing it the whole time. So who's the failure now? This is our entry point to this precept. Diane Rossetto. In this precept we explore what prevents us from meeting others on equal ground. I do not mean equal talents, abilities, strengths or weaknesses. Rather, I mean equal as human beings. This precept reveals the realm of competition and how we often view life as a game of winners and losers. With this precept, we'll continue to explore and deepen the themes we began to develop last time. How does our habitual judgment and ranking of ourselves and each other affect us? Is this natural, or is it something we just do? Or can we see it as part of the script by which we learn to be the social beings we are? Diane Rossetto again. Measuring ourselves to others is not just limited to speech, it also includes the actions we take with people. For example, we avoid, ignore or exclude others in our activities. We put ourselves above others, not only as individuals but as groups. No matter what side of an issue they're on, we may claim a superior, enlightened view. When we speak or act in this way, clarity, discovery and true dialogue are lost. Clearly, and as we looked at last time, our preconceptions and assumptions about both ourselves and others have a key role in forming our sense of who we each are in our relationship to each other. What we can call, in the widest sense, our identities. In fact, what kind of relationship is even possible while we, often without even being aware of it, are constantly judging and ranking? It's an obvious point, but one that needs stressing. I don't make up these criteria out of the blue. They're always social, collective. They reflect the aspirations, the assumptions and prejudices of my society as a whole, and of the tensions and resistance to those norms inherent in this society. But I begin the practice of this precept, as always, in the immediacy of my own experiencing and awareness. Diane Rossetto. Stop, look, listen. Notice the ways you measure yourself to others. As with the other precepts, study your actions, words, body and thoughts. You no doubt will find that there are certain favourites and some that are finely tuned for certain people and situations. When you do this inquiry, it's imperative that you work with the situation at hand. It can be any situation in which you catch yourself falling into measuring. Watch how your thoughts create a story about people rather than letting them reveal themselves. At some point, you'll be able to catch it every now and again before you begin to do it. Now experience what it's like to engage without the story. This needn't just be with new people, but can be with your partner, your kids, anyone you've known for a long time. Try meeting them as if for the first time, as strangers. Turn your attention to their physical characteristics. What's the colour of their eyes? Look at their faces, as if you were seeing them for the first time. Listen to what they're saying and how they're saying it, the words, the poises, and the voice intonation. As you find your thoughts going off into a storyline, return again and again to the person in front of you while staying in touch with the feelings or sensations that may arise. So this is work we begin off the cushion and in the reality of our everyday lives. Observe and become aware of our experiencing as it happens. But we can take this experiencing back to the cushion, as Rossetto invites us to do, in deepening the inquiry. Now you can ask yourself, what is the worst thing that could happen if I wasn't better than? Relax and settle into the question like an old sweater. This is the place of the dead spot. Don't push or demand an answer, but try to maintain openness so that the answer simply rises forth in your consciousness. This type of question is really an invitation for us to listen deeply. It's not a demand, and above all, it's not a test. The answer may come immediately, or it may take days, weeks, months of bringing our attention over and over to what it feels like when that possibility arises. The worst thing that could happen will take us in the direction of all that we're turning away from and avoiding. What we fear about the world and fear in ourselves, shame, vulnerability, lack of control, loss, sadness, despair. And yet it's only by way of this recognition that our responses find the space to soften, to transform. Dan Rossetto. Listen to and feel your feelings and body sensations. Whatever you experience is, just let it rise naturally. Breathing in and out. Let the thoughts about your experience melt into the experiencing itself as you breathe. In this place without comparison, you stand alone and present to the fullness of all that you are. Note the relation between listening to ourselves and hearing others. To meet you on equal ground, I have to be prepared to meet myself. In judging, in ranking us in relation to each other, I hold you separate from me. But I also hold me separate from myself. One of Diane's students practices in the following way. I made a practice that every time I found myself sitting with a group of people, in the train, on my way to work, in the meditation hall, in a meeting at work, I would go around the room, person by person, and observe how I experienced myself in relation to that person. What I realized was that whether I experienced myself as better than or worse than, the comparisons always put me absolutely at the centre, in my own mind, the centre of what everyone else was doing. As long as I was measuring, I was leaving the others out. I think this is an excellent practice, one we can return to as the months, years, decades pass. But I think this student's response only goes halfway. As long as I'm doing this, I'm creating and reinforcing an image of myself that's as false and as frozen as that I have of others. I don't place myself as I am at the centre, myself in the fullness of all you are, to borrow Diane's phrase, but I leave myself as I am out, as surely as I leave out others. We can't ever truly meet because neither of us are really present to experience. This is at the heart of two themes we'll explore through practicing with this precept. we'll stray into philosophy and psychology, sociology and politics. But this begins and ends in the intimacy of our experiencing of ourselves, of each other. What is human relationship, really? What does it mean to recognise each other? How does any of this relate to my ideas about you, about myself, and likewise to your ideas of self and other? If I ask, who am I? I might think the answer will be in terms of what makes me special, unique, separate. But to have a sense of self at all, I need to have a sense of other. No me without a you. And in fact, no me without us. The moment I start thinking about or describing myself as an individual, I can only answer in social terms about my relationships with and my similarities to and differences from other people. So if I ask you, who are you? Any possible answer you can give presupposes the existence of the society of which we're a part. My identity as me is created largely through this, not that choices. Do I identify as male or female, gay or straight, parent or child, black or white? My unique and intimate relationships also have this binary form. I'm Gracie and Flo's father, Gayna's husband, Pat's son. We make this relationship active when we recognise each other's role in it. Yes, I am the child to the parent you are. This is a first sense of recognition. We can call this recognition as. I will behave towards you as a child to its parent. I will accept from you what I recognise as a parent's actions towards their child. These identities shape the possibilities of each relationship. They form the ground, the basic rules we know to follow, or that we wish to challenge. We might remember the sankharas again here, those ways of seeing, feeling and thinking that shape us, and which are in the same moment shaped by us. So we are not talking about a set of consciously held ideas so much as a field of reactions and responses. In one sense, these form our social roles with respect to each other, what holds us together, for example, as parent and child, but also what keeps us separate. I am the child and you are the parent. They place limits on how we behave towards each other, and while some of these are necessary and welcome, others are stunting and harmful. If our relationship only ever stays within strict constraints, it will be incapable of growth, change, and any real intimacy. How fast, how tightly do we hold to these roles? All identity is relationship, and all relationships bring identities with them. These identities are a part of the stories we tell to ourselves and tell to other people. It's both the good news and the bad news that these stories don't always corroborate or reinforce each other fully, but instead may well conflict or cancel. As parents, we have all already been children, and perhaps in the eyes of our own parents, we still are. The different roles I have as part of different relationships may well grate against as much as confirm each other. Who I really am, well, may be a very different person in my own mind from the reality of me as I take part in the life of the world. Practice question. What relationships frame my different identities? How do the different aspects interrelate? Would other people see me the same way? Recognition equals misrecognition? In The Lies That Bind, Rethinking Identity, the contemporary philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah argues that our sense of identity is always both mistaken and necessary. that we collectively construct beliefs and practices around what it is to be a woman, or English, or white, or working class, or Buddhist, and so on, and that while we can only function as a society with and through these ways of thinking and acting, they all actually involve distortion, inconsistency, and sometimes downright lies about both ourselves and other people that have far-reaching and often very damaging consequences. Apai uses religion, nationality, race, class and culture as his axes of analysis, while allowing gender an important place that runs through all these discussions as perhaps the basic polarity of both social and psychological identity. From birth onwards, we experience gender both as it's mapped onto our own body and through evolving relationships with our parents, siblings and friends. Apai's list is by no means exhaustive, and our sense of self evolves as multidimensional in practice. We don't have an identity, but multiple aspects of identity that may reinforce, cancel, or simply lie alongside each other. So the major part of what makes me, me, turns out to be the sets of relationships, real or imaginary, that I have with other people, and the place I hold in turn in their networks of identity. It's this reciprocal nature of identity that's important, because so much of our reaction to other people is governed by our own sense of who we are in relation to them, and that we react most negatively towards them, often apparently irrationally so, when they appear to challenge our sense of who we ourselves are. Following Apai, we might say that this is actually because they appear to challenge our sense of who we misrecognize ourselves to be. Which is actually quite a Buddhist conclusion. I'm not an innately separate self, and I am not finally known to myself. What I think of or act out as my identity is the play of difference and sameness in my relationships in the world. But the delusion that you and I are actually what I believe you or myself to be has dangerous and far-reaching consequences which we inevitably misrecognize in each other. Practice question. In what situations have I become aware of this misrecognition of myself? In what ways do the stories I tell about what it is to be me, as a man, as a woman, as English, as straight or gay, as white, just not add up? Better than you. All identity is relationship. If this play of identity were merely neutral, simply about difference as a way of constructing ideas of self and other, then perhaps there would be little problem. We looked previously at how the way in which our identities are made is reliant on judging, and how this judgment implicitly or explicitly hierarchizes each and every one of those identities. This is the case whether it's just our own view as to Harry's less than responsible approach to his social commitments, or on the wider stage of our governments holding all Afghans or even all Muslims jointly responsible for their attack on our country. It's this idea of judging as the establishing of hierarchical ranking that this seventh precept brings to the fore. Is life itself a perpetual struggle of all against all? We're constantly assured that it is, and that from almost all quarters. From the foundational texts on the social contract that implicitly underlies the existence of our society, such as Hobbes's Leviathan, to a typical nature documentary showing us graphic images of hunter and prey, or the battles between males for dominance and control over the females of their harems. Competition as expressed through status hierarchy is presented as both natural and normative. From the point of view of such thinking, our alliances, cooperation and collaboration can only ever be contingent, tactical exceptions to the general rule. A classical example of this might be Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene from 1976, an anthropomorphizing of the genetic basis of Darwinian natural selection to implicitly explain and justify social inequality of all kinds, while masquerading as serious and objective science. Yet even in the decades following the publication of Darwin's The Origin of Species itself, attention was already being drawn to the inapplicability of Darwin's thought to the development of human societies. Modern anthropology has consistently found basic equality to be the founding principle of most successful human societies, to which the highly hierarchized civilizations of very recent times provide partial exceptions that witness the failure of the internal mechanisms common to all societies that keep inequality and hierarchy in check. Rossetto's example of the Tasmanian community reenactment is such a mechanism, working so that the individual placing themselves above everyone else can acknowledge their fallibility openly so they can put it into perspective, even laugh at it. This is a very sensible way of dealing with our behaviour. Instead, many of us measure ourselves as less than or better than others, often taking action that has hurtful consequences that can reach far into the future. I can't help hearing an echo here of something I sometimes find in Joko's talks and often find in Zen more generally. The implied idea that I came up with this self-defeating strategy, or at least that I wittingly chose to follow it. What the Tasmanian example shows is that all our responses are community-driven. We, as a community, choose to react in terms of reaffirming hierarchical judicial ranking, despite the dire consequences for us individually and collectively, rather than being able to opt for a more intelligent resolution of the problem. What I want, what I believe, say or do as an individual, is of limited consequence if others assent to our constantly reiterated attempts at ranking. What drives this process? We'll explore this at length in terms of the second precept, which, following Diane's sequence, we'll study fifth. For now, we'll merely comment that inequality is both the origin and outcome of dominant structures. Inequality as the result of a society's losing control of its ability to limit the share of its wealth held by individuals or groups within it. If our society has, in effect, chosen to allow the overlaying of an unlimited competitive ranking system onto the necessarily and increasingly cooperative nature of our lives, valuing some people and activities more highly than others, and placing the ability to define and control that ranking system within the hands of a relative few, then all our interactions become potential exercises in dominance, in the attempt to gain, retain, or extend our status and our access to resources. While dominance hierarchies within most mammal species are based solely on individual physical strength and the ability to subdue a single opponent, those within modern societies are based largely and even increasingly on parental wealth and cultural capital. As Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett have demonstrated statistically in their seminal The Inner Level, 2019, this heritable dominance, allied with the myth of individual unaided achievement, and hence that my material worth, my wealth, in some way corresponds to my worth as a human being, leads to individual competition whose ferocity is proportional to the levels of inequality across society as a whole. The myth of the self-made man is the alibi of privilege. No wonder it's so relentlessly promoted by those such as Donald Trump. While I may dream of winning the lottery, in practice I will be more concerned with the gains and losses to be had relative to my immediate peers, while still envying those who have more and feeling both fear and contempt for those who have less. Hence our tendency to elevate the self and denigrate others, is neither some personal eccentric glitch, nor our inevitable human nature. It's perhaps observable in some form at all times and in all places, but it's today one of our defining attributes as a society. It's hence a directly political act we execute, often unawares and almost always without reflection. It ties us to an agonistic, warlike, competitive understanding and way of life, that our existence is a permanent struggle of all against all, that the game of life can only ever produce winners and losers. If we do treat our lives as the struggle of all against all, then only my direct or indirect domination of others can appear to guarantee my control over my own life. We can see the way this plays out across society. I will look towards the favour of superiors at all levels who have the ability to promote my cause, and I'll join in the denigration of inferiors to try and demonstrate my alliance with those above me. But, it might be objective, isn't this just the kind of behaviour we all learn in the playground, the schoolyard? Exactly so, and Wilkinson and Pickett point to research showing that the bullying our children experience at school is proportional to the levels of material inequality within our society. Children who grow up in more unequal societies experience levels of bullying as much as 10 times higher than those in more equal countries. This also varies proportionately over time, as individual nations experience increasing or decreasing levels of inequality, and hence is nothing to do with any notion of a distinct national character. Our children are simply responding to the practices of the state of the society in which they find themselves placed. We have an apparent vested interest in supporting those in power and of demonising not only those who object to that dominance, but whose mere existence gives the lie to the beneficence of the existing social order. We can return to our discussions on the previous precept here. By judging others in a way that freezes them, reifies them, we expose them to a generalised personal shaming of themselves. The poor are ashamed of themselves for being poor. As it is our collective story, they've only themselves to blame. And so on with every other group we can identify, which is to say fabricate, through the way we see and understand the world. And that takes us back to the Buddhist Sankaras again. We all experience this from both sides. Although I'm white and educated, I'll still find contexts in which I'm merely a woman or disabled or gay or trans or young or old or not conventionally good looking or short or simply in some way less, and find myself experiencing the personal collective shame of being held to be so. Internationally, this plays out as my country, right or wrong, as the paramount nature of the national interest, as seeing any and all resistance to our control as a threat, and as a general hostility to foreigners, outsiders, economic migrants. Practice questions. Return to our practice of noticing the experience of being situated on either side of these inequalities. How do I think they're experienced by the person on the other side in each case? How is the experience of crossing from privileged side to less privileged? And vice versa. Recognizing the human. Of course, I as an individual don't have to consciously believe all of this. I'm caught up regardless of the pattern of the insecurity of perpetual implicit and explicit judgments of hierarchical ranking. Back to my experience we began with in the Zendo. The degree to which I feel superior, inferior, or even assertively equal to my fellow students reflects my general level of social anxiety and insecurity around judgmental ranking, whether that shows up as self-deprecation, narcissism, or anything in between. What may ameliorate this is, of course, getting to know, recognizing others as more than place markers for my own success or failure, more than competitors I must get ahead of or fall behind, more in fact as fully human beings. I say recognizing here in a second sense rather than the one we introduced earlier. This second is the sense in which Diane Rossetto defines this precept, meeting others on equal ground. And she says, I do not mean equal talents, abilities, strengths or weaknesses. Rather, I mean equal as human beings. If in one sense all recognition is misrecognition, an attempt to limit, to define, to make an identification, and the resonance with police usage here is intentional and revealing, this second sense of recognition is of an opening, a freeing, an embracing of the unknown and unknowable possibilities of relationship. A reminder of the sixth precept and its aspiration to relate with openness and possibility, to recognize each other in this sense, is not to assign each other to a biological species, but as being an equal centre of subjectivity, a true other to whom I am another that is at the same time their own centre of subjectivity. A centre of subjectivity in that, like me, they have a sense of self, of their own vulnerability, of their having intentions, desires, fears, that, like me, they have a sense of their own continuity with the past and with the possibility of a future. That you and I are, in these respects at least, permanently and definitionally equal. It is this fundamental equality which is at the heart of the problem of the dialectic of the master and the slave, explored by the philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Hegel at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries. Slavery was both materially and intellectually very much a present force in Hegel's world, but rather than addressing the real ills of his day specifically, his writing aims at better understanding the nature of human subjectivity itself and of the contradiction inherent in all domination and hierarchical ranking, a problem potentially present in all human relationships. It's ridiculous to try to summarize here the argument that Hegel evolved over many hundreds of pages. Does anyone remember Monty Python's Proust summarizing contest? But, broadly, the paradox is as follows. Wanting power and security, the master enslaves the other by force, who henceforth becomes his slave. His own material needs are entirely provided for by the slave, but only because he, the master, wields the power of life and death over this other. This is what makes him the master. The slave no longer has any right to anything. He's wholly dependent upon the master's demands, even his whims for his very life. He no longer can manifest even his will in any independent way. And yet, the master is now also dependent upon the slave, both materially and psychologically. Materially, he's dependent on the slave's labour and on the slave's compliance, forced as it is by the threat of violence. His power over the slave is finally entirely negative. Do this or I will kill you. He is no more human in the slave's eyes than a wild tiger or an earthquake. Equally, the slave is not human in the master's eyes. He's simply a piece of clever livestock you force to your will. Yet to be the master of the slave, in a way different from being, say, the owner of a cow, he needs the slave to offer him recognition as to his, the master's, being truly human. He needs there to be exactly that relationship between them, which is, in reality, entirely lacking. Any recognition the slave can offer is worthless, and in fact, meaningless, because the slave is by definition not an equal subject. Only an equal can offer this recognition, and by enslaving the slave, the master has rendered this impossible. This is a hugely powerful way of stating the mutual necessity we all have of each other. I am meaningless, inconceivable, impossible without you. To be me, to be real in this sense, I require you to be real also, to be like me but not me, to be the other that shows me I am me. To the extent I control or dominate you, you lose your independence from me, and hence I lose my own being, my own chance of being truly seen, recognized by an other. Is it any wonder that control, domination bring with them an often crippling insecurity and anxiety that demands always more and more again? A bigness that, in Hannah Arendt's phrase, is always finally impotent. Once more, far from being some annoying and unhelpful quirk, we see that the elevation of the self and the denigration of others touches into the heart of what is at stake in being human. Practice questions. How do these two very different senses of recognition show up in my intimate relationships? Can I see elements of both? And in my relationships with the wider world? To be continued in part 2.